What's up? This is Dr. Taylor Crick, host of the Autoimmune Doc podcast. And on this YouTube channel, I review papers from the scientific literature, peer-reviewed papers that I just find are interesting or that are associated with autoimmune disease, or some of the topics that are common in autoimmunity or that I cover on my podcast, just providing some of the peer-reviewed scientific evidence behind some of the things. So like, for example, your gut health, your gut microbiome matters. So I review a lot of literature about that because in autoimmune disease, there's a ton, and we know that there's a really, really big importance. Today's paper is about psychiatric disorders, which I think is also really interesting because how many psychiatrists and psychologists and counselors and mental health professionals are addressing the gut microbiome. I'd say it's roughly zero. I know there are some that are out there, but this is the direction that the scientific evidence is going and heading, is that all of these things matter to the inflammatory status of your brain, and the inflammatory status of your brain is going to matter towards the psychological status of your brain. Of neuroinflammation can drive brain fog, can drive depression, can drive anxiety, can drive schizophrenia, can drive PTSD, so Alzheimer's, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of literature out there, confirming this. So I review a lot of studies about, Alzheimer's and just different autoimmunities, neuroinflammatory autoimmunities, and so forth. So anyway, this is from October of 2020, Frontiers in Immunology, and it says a gut feeling. The importance of the intestinal microbiota in psychiatric disorders. So here's this abstract, which is the summary, and it's not that well written, but I'll show you just some of the things that are in here. And the takeaway from this is just that it matters. The takeaway isn't like, oh, you need to take this probiotic or this prebiotic, or you need to have this type of bacteria. The takeaway is just that it matters. So through lab testing, through supplements, through dietary changes, through lifestyle strategies that again are reviewed in other videos on this channel, evidence-based modalities, you can make an impact on this, and that's what you need to do if you have a psychiatric disorder. So the intestinal microbiota constitutes a complex ecosystem that is in constant reciprocal interactions with the immune system, the neuroendocrine system, and the neural systems of the host. Recent molecular advances have allowed for better measurement of this, basically. Clinical and experimental studies demonstrate that intestinal microbes may be intimately involved in the progression of diseases of the CNS. So we know that with MS, we know that with Alzheimer's, we know that with Parkinson's, and that's exactly what this is saying. But it says including those of affective and psychiatric nature. So more like depression, anxiety, PTSD. Gut microbes regulate the neuroinflammatory processes. They play a role in balancing concentrations of neurotransmitters like glutamate, GABA, dopamine, serotonin, and could provide beneficial effects against neurodegeneration. In this review, we explore some of these interactions between gut microbes and the nervous system during experimental disease and suggest that therapeutic approaches impacting the gut-brain axis may represent the next avenue for the treatment of psychiatric disorders. Cool. So let's keep going through this. In the intro, it says Darwin kept a diary where he would annotate feelings, often describing his trouble with the GI tract and anxiety. So I think that's it's interesting, but it's just an intro telling me about the gut feelings, about how a lot of people have associated feelings of mental with gut. And I'll say that clinically, I see that all the time. I see so many people that when their anxiety returns or exacerbates or flares, they will increase their gut protocols or whatever modality or thing we're using, and their anxiety will go back down. So it's very, very common. It's actually the most common thing that I see for anxiety, certainly. But yeah, it goes in and gut microbes as therapeutic agents against neuroinflammation. It talks about that. I'm not going to go through all of this, but let's look at this picture. And what it's basically saying is that the microbiome in the gut matters. Different things for microbial metabolism. These short chain fatty acids will block inflammation, will block disruption, and inflammation will lead to disruption and will disrupt this intestinal barrier integrity and cause that leaky gut. Now, if you've watched this YouTube channel, there are other papers that have better images of this. We know a lot of these images are showing the same thing, but the gut gets leaky and things enter and it leads to inflammatory processes that the brain is not immune to. These microbes can enter into the brain, or just even the inflammatory processes can affect the brain in different ways. It can affect the hypothalamic pituitary axis. It can affect the nervous system, the vagus nerve, and the enteric nervous system. And it can affect inflammation, so more of an immune response. So this is the immune response, this is the endocrine response, and this is the neurological response, as mentioned above. So, then it goes into the different conditions. So all this is saying, as I flip through it quickly, it's talking about the process behind this. So if you're curious about the process, about the cytokines and the different immune stimulation that's associated with this, then feel free to read this. I am interested, but I'm not gonna regurgitate it. Then let's look at this. So the diseases. So here's autism, schizophrenia, PTSD, depression, anxiety and stress. And then it talks about the release of different hormones and neurotransmitters and how, what all is associated with even that process, and then how is the gut microbiome associated with alterations in that process. So yeah, some of these factors such as inflammation and neurotransmitter balances are induced by alterations of the microbiome. And then talks about therapeutic directions. So prebiotics, probiotics, these are obviously non-pharmaceutical typically, but things that you can get just in a wellness retail space. Different microbial components and metabolites. Things like this might include short-chain fatty acids. Short-chain fatty acids are a very powerful modality or supplement that you can take, butyrate, propionate, acetate. And yeah, we use a lot of short-chain fatty acids for various inflammatory mechanisms of the gut and for shifting the microbiome. And then they talk about fecal microbial transplant, and that's a little more invasive, a little more outside of my scope, but the evidence behind it is pretty cool, where you basically take somebody else's microbiome and you import it into yours through capsules and pills typically. Yeah, so anyway, I think that's really, really cool. And let's just read the conclusion. Increasing evidence suggests that gut microbiome and the brain and the nervous system are connected by a reciprocal gut-brain axis with multifactorial components. Despite the difficulty of understanding the complexity between these interactions, it is now appreciated the relevance of the interactions with the gut. It's now appreciated the relevance of the interactions for health and disease. Studies in germ-free animals, as well as treated with antibiotics, probiotics, different studies, fecal transplantation, show that alterations of the microbiome may result in changes in behavioral outcome. Many questions remain to be answered. However, the impact on neuroinflammation appears to be a key route for the regulation of disease. In this context, it is now well established that gut microbiome, microbial products modulate the extent of pro and anti-inflammatory responses that could exacerbate or reduce the immunopathological parameters associated with the disease. This is a very wordy paper. This is written by some postgrad student who's trying to get a PhD. It's very, very wordy, but it's very, very good. And again, it's just showing that there's an association and that by altering the microbiome could have an impact. Now, as you've heard on my podcast and different things, you don't just want to go willy-nilly start taking probiotics, but there's stool testing, there's many, many, many different things. There's high-quality probiotics, there's prebiotics. Sometimes you need to pull weeds before you plant seeds. Again, there's many, many, many factors to this, but gut microbiome is absolutely a factor, and the evidence supports that.